Imagine if a modern tech giant like Apple or Amazon suddenly bought their own fighter jets and nuclear submarines. Sounds like a dystopian sci-fi movie, right? But in the 18th century, this actually happened. Meet the British East India Company, a private corporation that started out by just trading tea and spices. But eventually, these London businessmen decided that simply trading wasn't profitable enough. So, they bought an army that quickly grew to be twice the size of the official British military. With this corporate military machine, a few greedy businessmen sitting in a damp, gloomy London office managed to conquer the entire Indian subcontinent, subjugating over 200 million people. How on earth did a private company achieve the biggest corporate takeover in human history? And how did they do it without modern communications, crossing treacherous oceans on tiny wooden ships? Our story begins in the freezing winter of the year 1600. A group of ambitious London merchants formed a startup, begging Queen Elizabeth I for a trading monopoly. Their business plan was simple: sail to Asia, buy exotic spices like pepper, and sell them for a massive profit. But there was a huge problem. The Dutch were already there, heavily armed and dominating the spice trade in Indonesia. After getting violently kicked out of the Spice Islands, the battered English merchants had to quickly find a plan B. They turned their greedy eyes to India, a magnificent land ruled by the unimaginably wealthy and powerful Mughal Empire. In the early 1600s, the Mughal Empire was an absolute economic titan, producing nearly a quarter of the entire world's GDP. By contrast, Britain was just a damp, economically marginal island. Conquering India by force was literally unthinkable for these merchants. They knew they couldn't fight. So they did what businessmen do best. They put on a fake smile and started networking. In 1615, the company dispatched an official ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, directly to the opulent court of Emperor Jahangir. His mission was simple but humiliating: flatter the all-powerful emperor, kiss his ring, and beg for a trading license. Jahangir was profoundly unimpressed by the cheap English gifts, but he figured these odd, pale merchants were completely harmless. He tossed them a royal decree called a firman. The East India Company was officially allowed to set up shop on the coast. They built a tiny, seemingly innocent warehouse, known back then as a factory, in the coastal city of Surat. They kept their heads down, bought local Indian cotton, silk, and indigo, and shipped it all back to a hungry European market. The profits were absolutely staggering. The company's shareholders in London were swimming in a literal ocean of newfound wealth. However, doing business in the 17th century was extremely dangerous. The oceans were swarming with pirates and heavily armed European rivals. The French and Portuguese were already there, and they did not like sharing their lucrative trade routes with these British newcomers. The company's merchants felt incredibly vulnerable. They wrote panicked letters back to headquarters, begging for a way to defend their valuable cargo. So the directors in London made a seemingly minor administrative decision. They authorized the hiring of a few local security guards, just a handful of men with muskets to protect the warehouses. It was the tiny spark that would eventually ignite a continent. For nearly a century, the company just quietly traded. But in 1707, the last great Mughal emperor Aurangzeb died. His death left a massive power vacuum. The once unified empire fractured into dozens of smaller kingdoms, and local warlords began fighting for control. Suddenly, India was a very dangerous place to do business. Company caravans were being robbed, and their profits started to plummet. Back in London, the shareholders were furious. They demanded their investments be protected at all costs. The East India Company stopped building simple warehouses. Instead, they started building massive, heavily armed fortresses. And those few security guards? They were rapidly multiplied into a professional, uniformed army equipped with the latest European muskets. Local Indian princes quickly noticed that these British traders had the best disciplined troops and the most advanced artillery. So, the company started renting out its corporate army as highly paid mercenaries. If a prince wanted to crush his rival, he just hired the British. With their superior firepower, the company's troops easily won these proxy wars, establishing their clients as the new rulers. But war is expensive. When the local princes inevitably couldn't pay their massive mercenary bills, the company forced them to hand over land and tax collecting rights instead. The debt trap was perfectly executed. The directors in London had an epiphany. Why bother buying tea and spices with gold when you can just conquer the land and force the locals to give it to you for free as taxation? The mask was off. The East India Company transformed from a trading enterprise into an aggressive, expansionist corporate empire. They were no longer just merchants. They were warlords, and they were about to pull off the most audacious heist in history. The year is 1757. The target? Bengal, the absolute richest province in all of India, famous for its textiles and immense wealth. The young, aggressive ruler of Bengal, Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowla, was sick of the British fortifying their trading posts without permission. To deal with him, the company sent Robert Clive, an ambitious, ruthless, and incredibly greedy corporate officer. They met at the Battle of Plassey. But there was a slight issue. Clive had only 3,000 men, while the Nawab fielded a massive army of 50,000 soldiers, complete with heavy artillery and armored war elephants. Fighting a fair battle meant complete annihilation. But Clive wasn't a noble knight looking for glory. He was a corporate middle manager looking for a loophole. Why fight when you can just buy the enemy's management team? Before the battle, Clive secretly contacted Mir Jafar, the Nawab's top general. The deal? Betray your boss, and we'll make you the new ruler. When the two armies finally faced off, a massive monsoon rainstorm hit the battlefield. The British had quickly covered their gunpowder with tarpaulins. The Nawab's men did not. Their massive artillery was completely ruined. Desperate, the Nawab turned to his trusted general, Mir Jafar, and ordered the massive cavalry charge to crush the British. And Mir Jafar literally did nothing. His thousands of troops just stood there, watching the clouds. Realizing he had been completely sold out, the Nawab fled. Clive won the battle with only 22 casualties. As a reward for installing a puppet ruler, the East India Company was handed the keys to the Bengal treasury. Clive personally took home millions in today's money, while the company effectively became the new, incredibly wealthy government of India. After Plassey, the East India Company controlled a territory larger than Britain itself. But scaling up a business brings new corporate challenges. To hold on to their new empire, they needed a massive military presence. However, shipping British soldiers across the globe was incredibly expensive. European troops demanded high wages, and half of them died from tropical diseases before they even saw a battlefield. Bad return on investment. So, the board of directors came up with a brilliantly ruthless corporate solution: military outsourcing. Why import soldiers when you can hire locally? They began recruiting tens of thousands of Indian peasants, training them in European military tactics. These local soldiers were known as sepoys. For an Indian farmer, the company offered something rare: a guaranteed, regular monthly salary, a sharp uniform, and a steady supply of food. It was an irresistible job offer. Men lined up by the thousands to sign employment contracts with the foreign tea merchants. But here is the truly evil genius of the company's business model. They didn't use London's money to pay these local recruits. They used the taxes they violently squeezed out of the Bengali people to pay Indian soldiers to conquer even more Indian territory. It was a self-funding machine of conquest. The corporate army swelled at a terrifying rate, ruthlessly swallowing up neighboring kingdoms one by one. By the early 19th century, the East India Company commanded a private army of over 260,000 men. Let that sink in. A private corporation selling tea and spices had a military force twice the size of the official British Army. With this overwhelming muscle, the company enforced strict monopolies. Local weavers were forced to sell their goods at rock-bottom, unprofitable prices. If they refused, company thugs would break their looms or physically beat them. It was maximum efficiency, optimizing shareholder value through pure violence. Back in London, stock prices soared to the moon. But in Bengal, this relentless corporate greed was about to trigger an apocalyptic catastrophe. In 1769, a severe drought struck the region of Bengal. The rains failed, and the crops withered and died. Under normal circumstances, a responsible government would immediately lower taxes and distribute emergency grain to save its people. But the East India Company was not a government. It was a corporation. And corporations care about one thing: the profit margin. To compensate for the lower agricultural output and keep their shareholders happy, the company actually raised taxes by 10%. Tax collectors ruthlessly squeezed the peasants for everything they had, taking their seed grain and leaving them with absolutely nothing to eat. What followed was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, a man-made catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. To make matters worse, company officials hoarded what little rice was left in their massive warehouses, refusing to release it unless people paid inflated prices. Millions starved in the streets, but the company's ledgers remained perfectly balanced. An estimated 10 million people perished. 1/3 of Bengal's entire population was wiped off the map. And how did the East India Company directors in London react to this apocalyptic tragedy? They paid themselves an increased dividend of 12.5%. It was the ultimate demonstration of corporate sociopathy. They literally stepped over millions of graves just to collect their tax revenue. But eventually, reality caught up with them. You see, dead people don't pay taxes, and they certainly don't harvest crops. With 1/3 of their taxpayers gone and massive military bills to pay, the East India Company's revenue suddenly fell off a cliff. The most powerful corporation on Earth, the company that had looted an entire continent, was officially flat broke. Unable to pay their debts, the directors did what all giant corporations do when they mess up. They ran to the government, begging for a massive bailout. The British government looked at the crying merchants. The company owed massive taxes to the crown and was deeply integrated into the British economy. If the East India Company collapsed, it would drag the entire British financial system down with it. They were simply too big to fail. So, in 1773, Parliament passed an act granting the company a massive bailout loan of £1.5 million. But there was a major catch. The government wasn't just giving them free money, they wanted a leash on the beast. For the first time, Parliament placed regulatory control over the company's affairs. Government officials moved right into the corporate boardroom. The East India Company became a bizarre, mutant entity. Half private, profit-seeking business, half official arm of the British Empire. Meanwhile, in India, this new state-backed corporate machine just kept on rolling. The sepoy armies pushed further inland. They kept the Mughal emperor on his throne purely for show, maintaining the illusion of local sovereignty while secretly pulling all the strings. By the 1800s, the company was acting like a full-fledged government. They built railways, laid telegraph lines, and established their own courts of law. But they also began aggressively imposing British social norms, education, and religious attitudes onto a highly traditional Indian society. This cultural arrogance created deep resentment. For the sepoys, the final straw came in the form of a new rifle cartridge, rumored to be greased with animal fat, a profound religious insult to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the corporate managers, sitting in their comfortable offices, completely ignored the warnings. They had built their entire empire on the backs of a local mercenary army they treated with contempt. The East India Company was sitting on a massive powder keg, and in 1857, the spark finally reached the powder. The Sepoy Mutiny erupted. The very army the company had built to conquer India had just turned its guns on its corporate masters. The rebellion of 1857 was incredibly brutal. It wasn't just a mutiny. It became a massive, chaotic war for independence. Both sides committed horrific atrocities. The East India Company completely lost control, and their corporate infrastructure went up in smoke. The situation was so disastrous that the actual British government had to send in the real, official British army to crush the rebellion. After millions of lives were ruined, the British Parliament had finally had enough of this rogue corporation. In 1858, the Government of India Act was passed. The East India Company was officially stripped of all its powers, its territories, and its army. All of its stolen assets were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was now the official ruler of India. India became known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The era of corporate rule was over, and the era of the British Raj had begun. But looking back, the story of the East India Company remains one of the most terrifying warnings in human history. It shows us exactly what happens when a private business is allowed to grow so large and so powerful that it becomes accountable to no one except its shareholders. When human lives are just numbers on a balance sheet, a trading company can easily become an empire of blood. Today, we worry about the power of global tech giants data mining our lives. But at least Amazon hasn't built its own navy. Yet. The East India Company might be dead and buried at the bottom of the ocean of history, but the lessons of corporate greed are as relevant today as they were 300 years ago. If you enjoyed this journey into the absurdity of empire, make sure to subscribe to Crown and Colony for more historical deep dives. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.